Okay, let's kick this off. Hi, guys. Welcome to our seventh functional tennis webinar. They've gone great so far. This is the last one of the year, but to me, one of the most exciting ones of the year because we've Mark Kovacs on, who is a tennis nerd, you could say. He knows so much about the game at many different levels, many different facets of the game. And we had a podcast episode of him last week, which was fantastic. The reviews were really good and people are really excited about this. So the area we're covering is the pathway to the top 100, which is, it's everybody wants to get to the top 100. That's one of the first goals that tennis professionals and juniors have, is how do you break into the top 100? And so many players don't make the top 100. Most of my friends, all of my close friends, none of them broke the top 100. And some of them got stuck at 120, some at 140, some at 200, some at 500. But Mark is going to break it down for us, and he's going to tell us, more about it. I'm not 100% sure what he's going to say, but he's a lot more knowledge than I have. He's worked with players at all different levels, all different ages, who've got to the highest, the best players in the world. So he knows a lot about this area, which I'm really excited about. And before we move on to him, Keen's here. So if any questions, please leave them in the chat feature, or there's a question, the Q&A box, leave them there. Keen will ask Mark afterwards. We'll have about 15 minutes of Q&A. And yeah, that's it. So Mark's going to jump on now, and I'm going to turn the video off so we can concentrate on Mark. So Mark, nice to have you and looking forward to this.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And as you mentioned, this is one of the most interesting topics. And like you said, a lot of people that are hoping to be a professional tennis player, this is sort of one of their first major objectives is how do you break into the top 100 in the world? Because as most people know, the financials around tennis become quite attractive once you make that top 100 number. The reason being is it gives you direct entrance into the 4 major Grand Slams at that ranking point. And that is significant extra money, financial aspects, and also that ranking cut point allows you into a lot of the major other tournaments. So it's not just a round number. That's why people are excited by it, but it's actually financially a very, very important cut point in the world of tennis to really show that you're making money playing the sport. As we know, anyone outside the top 100 really doesn't make any income playing because of the high expenses, the travel, the coaching, or the food, all the different things that go on with being a professional tennis player. So that's why this number is so valuable. It's also really important for federations and other large academies that are trying to show their worth in different ways and based on what's their return on investment per player. So we've done a lot of analysis of this over the last 10 years or so, both from a statistical standpoint, looking at objective metrics, but also doing interviews with coaches, federations, agents, parents to figure out what are some of the limiting factors. What are some of the things that speed up this pathway? And what areas can people work on if that's their objective? So to start with, I'll give you a little background about how this all came about. Nearly about 8 years ago now, we were evaluating return on investment, both from a federation perspective, but also from, effort and dollars being put to each player that has some potential. And potential is a scary word. We all know that. It means that you haven't achieved anything yet, really, but you're showing signs that with certain improvements, you may get to this level. You may have physical skills, you may have tennis IQ, you may have good genetics, you may have a work ethic. So there are all these different variables that people look at young ages to say, they have a few of these things that we know are predictors of success, but most people don't have all of them. And the goal is then to fix or improve the areas that are lacking with the goal of getting that person to have all the skills that are needed to be top 100 in the world. As we know, there's a lot of variables in the junior game: height, speed, parents' background, finances, ability to travel, ability to play multiple matches in a day, fitness. All these things come into an athlete's ability to work through some of these. Some athletes are better at certain areas and not so good at others. So it's very, very difficult to evaluate all the variables. So in my background, we've evaluated the physical aspects very, very well, and we have very clear metrics on what is required. Also have evaluated results, so objective results, rankings, tournament results, things like that. So a lot of today is going to be focused on the tournament result metrics side of things. It's sort of black and white. Your results are what your results are. It doesn't take into account other factors, but it gives you an objective marker. So for folks that aren't familiar with some of the work I've done, so we've published this in peer-reviewed scientific journals. We've done 2 major analyses over the last sort of 8 years or so. The first one was based on 2014 data. So we were doing this for the first time, and we, interviewed about 20 or so of the best coaches, high performance directors in the US predominantly. And that was both at the junior academy level, the federation level, Davis and Fed Cup captains, former players that are now coaching that made it to the top 100, and really evaluated what do we all think are the most important metrics. And there's a long, long list, and we have hundreds of pages of data evaluated, and that takes into account how many matches were played at every age group, 14, 16s, 18s, ITF juniors, where their results were, meaning that we had certain cut points. How many times did they make a semi-final in a tournament? In all the evaluations, not just my perspective, but these expert coaches, we wanted to define going deep in a tournament. And what was the definition of going deep in a tournament? And everyone was sort of in agreement that if you made a semi-final of an event, it means that you were at that level. So if you make your quarters or you make a round of 16 at most junior tournaments, you may have got a lucky round or two. Someone may have pulled out with injury. You may have got a wild card and won a couple rounds that weren't necessarily representative. So making semifinals of events was a marker of success at that level. And as you moved up in level, how quickly were you able to make a semi-final? Was it 1 or 2 tournaments? Was it 6 months? Things like that. And that was an important metric to show that your level had actually improved, because there's a lot of players that have these one-off results that aren't really predictive. And people get very excited about a one-off result, and we have to be very careful about that. Then we also were able to evaluate, all the various ranking objectives, from Tennis Europe rankings to ITF rankings to USTA junior rankings from a junior perspective. And then also, where were these individuals at the ATP and WTA level, meaning that at different perspectives and different time points, were they hitting certain benchmarks? So we created a list of benchmarks based on the data. So this was 100% objective. There was no subjective opinion in any of this, and it was just purely what the data showed. And we had 4 major cut points. You had a top 10 pathway, you had a top 25 pathway, a top 50, and a top 100 pathway. So, and then it was people that were off the pathway. So we did some further analysis after the fact of people that were on the pathway at certain times and then dropped off the pathway, meaning that they didn't make the top 100. And why? Was it injury based? Was it scheduling issues? Was it inability to play on different surfaces? So there's a lot of factors that come into why people make it and also why people don't. The really good part about this analysis was tennis is a very predictive sport. It's quite easy to predict who's going to make it and who's not at the highest levels, meaning a top 10 level player. Top 10 pathway is very, very different than a top 100 pathway, which makes some sense. To be at the top of the mountain, there's less air up there. There's less ability to get there. You have to have multiple skill sets, and you show it at a young age. So, the people that are looking or think that, it's a late developing sport, it really isn't. Tennis shows itself at the highest levels early on. All the greats of the game were all really, really, really good high-level juniors. So it's important to understand that. The top 100 pathway is a lot different though. There is a lot more variability. Players can get there later. Players can take slightly different paths to get there. But so we have to understand that depending on what you're looking at, there is a very easy, predictive way of saying, hey, you need these results at these time points to have a chance of being top 10. And again, for folks that aren't that familiar, being top 10 in the world is nearly impossible. So it's a very, very hard thing to do. And we have to realize that. And that's why it's so predictive, because it is so hard. You have to be the best of the best, the most exceptional of the exceptional. And, you know, from a understanding, so we're going to talk a bit more on the top 100 and what that looks like. So when we're talking about it from a perspective of countries, let's start with there. You know, we've got, you know, France, Sweden, Germany, Spain, US, historically, since 1990, were the major countries that would, you know, consistently put out the highest numbers of players in the top 100. Over time, that's changed. Globalization, we've got way more countries competing. You're getting a lot more smaller countries putting out 1, 2, 3, 4 players in the top 100 more consistently. So you don't have the same predictability of which countries are putting out the most amount of players. So that's important. And that's male and female predominantly. So when we're looking at ATP data, so men's data, the age when people first reach the top 100 is an interesting one to discuss. So from our 2014 data, it's under 19 when the top 10 in the world reach top 100. So, you know, they're anywhere from 17 to 19 is normally what we see. The top 100 though is around 22. So there's a 3-year differential between the top 10 pathway and the top 100 pathway. So it takes the best players in the world about 3 years sooner to break in on average than the regular top 100 player. So that makes sense because, you know, they're always playing 1 or 2 years above their age group anyway. I mean, we know, you can look back and you see some of these Orange Bowl champions that are 15, 16, 17 years old in the 18th age group on the men's side. On the women's side, it's even younger. You need to usually be 2 years ahead of your age group, sometimes 3, to be on that top 10 pathway on the majority of times. And again, it's something that a lot of people don't always realize, that if you're really good in your age group nationally, you're still a couple levels behind the top players in the world. If you're really good in your age group internationally, you're still possibly a year, sometimes 2 years, depending if you're male or female, behind the best in the world. So it's really important to understand that the levels do change, and it becomes harder and harder, and you have to be better and better the higher your expectations are. And again, we're just looking at objective data, and we can talk a lot anecdotally about what are the areas people need to focus on the most. But from an objective data perspective, that's really important. So that's something that's of interest to most people. So being really good at young ages sometimes isn't good enough, meaning that you think you're doing well because you're the best in your age group, but internationally, you're actually potentially behind a little bit. So that's an important area to focus on. From a junior perspective, which a lot of people are interested, where do you have to be when you're a bit younger? 12s, 14s, 16s, 18s. 12s is a really hard age group from a predictive standpoint due to growth factors that kick in around 13 and 14. So trying to predict at the very young ages is really difficult, and the data supports that. You'll always have your individuals that show themselves at 12 as being some of the best in their age group, but be careful about going immediately to the number 1 or 2 or 3 person in that age group, because very rarely does that transfer all the way up. You have these occasional players that can, but usually 12s is not the most predictive age group. 14s, you start seeing things, meaning that in the US, every top 100 ATP player was in the mix in the national rankings in the 14s over the last decade, meaning that they may not have been the best. They maybe weren't number one or two in their age group, but they were playing at a high national level. So that tells us there really aren't these outliers that people sometimes talk about, these late, very late developing individuals, or folks that pick up tennis in 13 or 14 and then make it to top 100 in the world. Doesn't mean that won't ever be a possibility, but historically we haven't seen it. So important to understand that you have to be playing at a high level at that 12, 14 age group. You don't have to be the best, but you have to be showing that you have the physical skills, the mental skills, the competitive drive, all those factors to be somewhat competitive at that age group. When we get into 16, people really start showing themselves, because at the 16 age group, most of the best international level players are already playing ITF juniors. They're playing some pro events. They're splitting their schedule. The best players in the world at that stage are splitting schedules between juniors and pros, and they're starting to make, some headway in the pro game. So at 16s, you're usually a top 10 player in your country or better, and you're already starting to play at the higher levels of the ITF junior circuit, and you're playing a ATP or WTA type schedule. So really important to understand scheduling at that age. 14 through 16 is predominantly junior tournaments. 16 and up is predominantly a split between the highest level junior events and predominantly professional tournaments and lower level professional tournaments for most people. But you're playing against fully grown individuals. You're traveling to locations that may be a little bit different. You're having to work your way up through the ranking list. And again, we know that going into next year, schedules may be different due to the pandemic and due to what's going on. But the nice thing about all the data we've collected is it's all comparative to what happened before 2020. So it gives us a sense of what's going on from that. So if we take this a bit further into the 18s, which is where a lot of people start having to make decisions. Am I going, in the US at least, am I going to college, or am I going to turn pro? That's probably one of the biggest areas of focus, and work with a lot of college programs, a lot of agents, a lot of coaches and parents on this discussion. And my goal is not to give my opinion. My goal is to show you the facts and say, hey, you guys make the best decision possible about which path you want to take. And there's not a right or wrong answer here, because there are multiple variables, but I'll show you objectively what you're at, where you're tracking, and how many people have succeeded on your track before. There's always the potential that someone's different, but in general, it's quite predictive and it's quite consistent. It's quite easy to make that determination of whether someone should go pro or whether someone should go to college from a results perspective. That's not taking into account, do they like to study? Do they want to be in a team environment? All those other, factors. So, but from a results standpoint, we know that at 17 and 18, in the US anyway, you're in the highest levels of tennis at that stage. So you're nationally in the top 5 usually in your country, and internationally, if you played an international schedule, there's the occasional person that doesn't, but nearly everyone played a ITF schedule to a certain extent, not a full schedule, but maybe 8 tournaments, something like that, 10 tournaments, and they were usually in the top 30 in the ITF juniors. And if they played a pro schedule somewhat, 10 to 15 pro tournaments a year, potentially, they were at a decent level, a top 500 ATP level, usually a top 300 WTA level. So those are on the pathway. Anyone that really didn't hit certain benchmarks like that were what we call, they're not currently on the pathway. And that helps them make some decisions on what they should be doing. Should they, continue on the pro path? Should they consider college? And again, it doesn't mean that one's better than the other, or you should or shouldn't take a certain objective down a certain path. It's just trying to provide you with information to help you make your decisions and what's most likely. So height is an interesting aspect. We looked at that. It's always a question we get is, does height make a difference? It really doesn't in the top 100. Once you get inside the top 100, it potentially does outside the top 100. So, there is, on the men's side, we're a little above 6'2" now as the average height. So it's moving up. 10 years ago, it was a little over 6'1", the average height. So it's creeping up. You're seeing a lot more of these 6'5", 6'6", 6'8", 6'9" type players that are playing at a higher level. So over time, heights have been creeping up. Age on the men's side is a little over 28 years of age, the average age of the top 100. And that was creeping up for many years. It's starting to dip back down as some of these players are retiring and the younger generation are coming in larger numbers. So it's important to sort of understand that even though we know that to break into the top 100 is around 22, give or take, the average age is 28. So a lot of people don't give up their spot in the top 100, which means it's hard for people to break in. When we reevaluated the difference in the top 100 between 2014 and 2019, on both men's and women's side, there was approximately 60 to 64, depending on what we're looking at, new players that were in the top 100. So in 5 years, you had a more than 60% turnover top 100. So there were quite a few new people, more than half new people in the top 100. However, you can all think about it, some of the top players on the men's side hadn't really changed. They were still the same, 3 or 4 players. On the women's side, you had a bit more change, but you still had some of the players that had been there for a long time were still leading the game. So from an ITF junior perspective, the data was very consistent back in 2014. In 2019, when we did our updated studies, the data is a bit more complex because people are playing now multiple schedules. It used to be the ITF junior circuit was a major emphasis, and it was where all the best players pretty much outside of Spain usually didn't send a lot of people to the ITF junior events, but nearly all other countries did. So you had the best players in the world competing against each other for at least 6 to 10 tournaments a year, the slams and some of these major grade A and group 1 events. So it was easy to see who were the best in the world. It was easy to sort of see the level difference when people were improving. Now, a lot of people realize that you don't necessarily have to play the ITF events. You can go play pro events and work your way up that way and maybe stay closer to home, not spend as much money on travel, some of those factors. So now the ITF junior results aren't as predictive because you don't have all the best players playing it. So if you don't have all the best players in the events, it's really hard to use it as a guidepost because it's only a snapshot. It's not giving you the total picture. So be careful overemphasizing the ITF results because we don't have the whole picture. And that's an important differentiator from our early studies to now our most recent studies. So the pro data is still relevant because the ATP and WTA, sort of minor league events, your futures and challenger events on the men's side, and some of the events that were under 100,000 on the WTA side were very useful as predictors. All max counts. So we looked at every player's max counts from their young ages all the way through to reaching the top 100 and then into the top 10 for the ones that made it into the top 10. And max counts and scheduling is a huge aspect of this. For example, when we're looking at a 14-year-old who played an ITF circuit predominantly, they were playing on average about 7 to 8 matches a year at 14. Whereas at 16, they played some of their heaviest schedules at 29 matches per year. At 15 on the men's side, they were above 30, the top 10 players. So at 15, they played their heaviest ITF junior schedule. At 16, it was similar, but they were starting to drop the numbers and they were playing more ATP events. At 17, it was cut in half. So they hardly played compared to when they were 15. So the only events they would have played are probably the slams. And that's 3 years, I think, ahead of what, 2 to 3 years ahead of what many coaches and parents may be thinking, meaning that at 17, 18 is when you play your prime ITF events. Whereas that's true for a lot of players, but that's not the best players in the world. The best players in the world are usually playing their heaviest ITF junior schedule at 15 and 16. On the women's side, it's actually 14 and 15. So the women in general are a year to a year and a half behind, in front, meaning they do it faster than the men, which I think most people realize. Females can compete at the WTA level at a slightly younger age, and we see that over and over again. And that's been something we've seen for 30 plus years. So we have to realize that the pathway for the men on the ATP is different than the pathway for the women on the WTA. And understanding that is really valuable because it allows you to be realistic about where people are at. Some people have trouble accepting the realities because everyone's a good tennis player. I mean, if you're top 100 in the country, in the US, you're a really good tennis player. But top 100 in the US is not predictive of having professional success at 18. You're a long way off the pathway at that point. You really have to be top 5 in the country, top 10 at that stage. And actually, you have to be a couple of levels above that, meaning you have to have some results on the WTA tour. You have to have some results at the highest levels of the ITF to show that you can compete and your level is good enough to play with the best in the world. And that's a hard reality sometimes because most of these players have been very good and have been the best at the level they've played for a number of years. It's just there's always 1 or 2 levels higher up that they have never seen or don't even haven't competed against. So that's some really interesting evaluation data. We also looked at top 10 players and tried to sort of pass out and substratify out those players to highlight where their pathways were different than everyone else. And you'll always get in the top 10 somewhat of an outlier, meaning that there's a player that has become a top 10 player that wasn't tracking to be top 10. They were all tracking to be top 100. And that's pretty easy to see. But there was a couple always that, didn't necessarily, be the best at its age, but they were really good and something clicked, whether they grew a lot, whether their work ethic changed, but they always had the skill set. And that's what I think a lot of people don't realize, that every player in the top 10 in the world was always one of the best players coming through. So it's important to realize that there really aren't outliers in this sport. And when we say an outlier, truly mean an outlier, multiple standard deviations away from the mean. And doing the statistical analysis on all this allows us to have a narrow band, meaning a 1 standard deviation band from the mean. And that's your most predictive, that's your most likely outcome. And then the further out you take the standard deviations, you can then start widening the net. And depending on who you are, you may have a very narrow standard deviation. This may be an agent who's looking to sign 1 or 2 players and doesn't have the luxury of making mistakes necessarily. So they're going to have a narrow standard deviation. Whereas, let's say, a federation that has decent resources, they may have the ability to provide funding and resources to a slightly larger number of players to make sure, hopefully, they don't miss anyone. And for them, they may go 2 standard deviations from the mean. So you can use this data to really help. And from a parent perspective, parents have just like the players, very emotional. They're so connected and so close to the situation. Having this objective data can really help in some respects give you a different perspective that is objective, that hopefully you can trust and know that it's not opinion, it's not someone trying to say the right things, but it's just, this is what the data's showing. It's just one more piece of information to help you make a better decision about are you going to sort of pursue a certain path, or are there certain things that you want to work on? For the folks that may be thinking about this concept and don't have the required results right now, that's when the full evaluation needs to happen. Why? Is it physical? Is it mental? Is it emotional? Is it resources? Is it your training habits? Is it your scheduling? And that's what we do a lot, is kind of work with these coaches, work with these agents about putting together these plans to help navigate this process using objective data. Because everyone comes at this with a lot of emotion. Everyone wants these players to succeed. But sometimes the players, one, don't have the ability, which you also have to be honest about. Doesn't mean they can't make a sort of an attempt at it, but they've got so many roadblocks and so many barriers from multiple factors that may make it very difficult to do, that it may be challenging. But most of the people I deal with, they have some ability. They've had some results that would suggest there is possibility there. They may have had 2 or 3 great results, but they don't have the consistent body of work. Those people need to figure out what they need to work on, because those people actually do have the chance to make it. And you see that a lot when people have a result or 2 at a higher level than what they're currently playing. That's a really good sign that they have the game to move to the next level. And we see that a lot with juniors, 16, 17-year-olds. They get a wild card into an ATP or WTA event and they make the quarters or they make the semis. And it's sort of a result that's above their current level, but it gives you confidence that they have the game to move to the next level. And if they have 2 or 3 of these, that's a really good sign. If they only have 1, you have to ask yourself, why? Is it lack of opportunity, or is it actually that they got a very lucky draw? And you have to sort of pass through that a little bit. So I could talk on this topic for days, because it's something we study nearly every day. We look at the numbers, we look at the data. We know what historically has happened over the last decade with all the players on the ATP and WTA tour. And then that gives you a sense of what is the most likely outcome. I use this kind of as a kind of like a stock ticker and tracker, that past performance doesn't predict future results, but it gives you a much better chance of making good decisions, because you're just looking at the information actively. And we know the cut points. We know when players are on the pathway, and we know when players are off the pathway. And sometimes a player will be on the pathway for 6 months to a year and then drop off the pathway. Those are the players that we say are near the pathway, because they've been on there and they've dropped off, which means they've got some ability. They've done certain things that puts them in a certain category. And those are the ones, if you're an agent or if you're a federation, you should be putting more resources towards, not less. Unfortunately, sometimes, folks give up on those players early because they may have been great last year, and then this year they're not so good, and they move on to the next shiny object. And there aren't many great shiny objects out there. So you've got to keep resources going towards those ones that show some potential and show some ability, because you don't lose ability in this sport. You lose work ethic, you lose the right advisors, you lose the right way of planning your schedule. And if you can fix those things, this player's already shown that they have ability. And that's one of the hardest things to find in this sport, is players that truly have a top 100 ability and a top 10 potential. And if you come across any of those, the resources should be applied appropriately, and you should put the best possible team around them to help that player succeed. So hopefully that gives people some insights into some of this stuff. If people want more details, feel free to email me and contact me. I can send you the studies that we've published on this. And in our Kovacs Academy site, we have a bunch of interviews and blogs and written stuff that goes through all this in great detail. But hopefully this gives people a sense of what goes on, and hopefully it helps from a discussion standpoint as well.
Mark, that was really good. Very interesting. You touched on a lot of great topics. I have a few questions here, but mainly we're going to get through the Q&A from the viewers there. But I was interested to hear, like when you're saying like the male and female, the boys and girls should be playing their big schedule when they're 15 and 16 and girls younger. That's interesting. That's a mind shift because everybody thinks, oh, 18, I'm at my strongest. That's when I have the best chance. But ideally, you got to be making noise when you're 15 and 16. And then, as you say, concentrate on the senior tournaments when you're 17 and 18. You're playing a lot more of them because I'm not sure exactly of Federer's junior history, but Rafa didn't play many juniors. He was straight into futures at 15 and 16. I'm sure if you look back, as you say, most of the top 10 guys were futures at 15 and 16. But just two questions before we jump into other questions. One is, how do, you have a federation or you have an academy and they see potential in a player and they want to direct a lot of energy there, but there's always backlash from parents. And I've heard coaches talk about it where other parents give backlash to coaches and to federation directors saying, why aren't you giving my kid enough attention? But their kid may not be good enough. How would you handle something like that when you have parents, they're on your team, they're in your squad, but you're giving more attention to the more promising player? How would you handle that as a boss, let's say?
Yeah, so I use this saying a lot. The most unequal treatment is the equal treatment of unequals. So if you listen to that, the most unequal treatment is the equal treatment of unequals, meaning that in professional sport, whether it's tennis, basketball, baseball, football, whatever it is, people aren't treated equally. They're treated fairly based on their outcomes. So just like a professional coach gets sacked or fired if they don't have good results, same thing with players. You can't sort of support players from this subjective metric. I'm not saying emotionally and all that. I'm saying from results if they're not having results. I mean, results at a certain level is what professional sport is about. At a very young level, it's not about results. It's about developing technique and understanding of the game and enjoyment and trying to keep them in the sport and progress. But at a certain level, objective metrics and data is what everyone makes decisions about. And that's why it's valuable to provide these objective metrics as a reason behind decision making. That's not your only reason. We always say you want to have one category available for subjectiveness, meaning that, hey, this player may be a year behind in certain objective metrics that we can measure, but they have some athleticism, or they have something unique about them, or they have a ability to win certain matches if they're put in certain environments. Whatever it is, you want to have that subjective component there. But in general, way too many people fantasize around this, once in a generation scenario that doesn't really happen. And if you're trying to put resources to folks and you've got limited resources, which every academy does, every federation does, you can't put your bets on that outlier. You have to put your bets on the most likely outcomes.
Okay, thanks for that. And just another quick one before we jump into the other ones. What about I get a lot of questions sent to me, which academy should my kid go to? Should we travel across the world? Should we do this? What's your thoughts on the importance of going to academy? I try and play it down or try and check out all of them, see which one works for you. But these, it's $30,000 to $60,000 a year to go to these academies. And a lot of them are money-making exercises, I feel. The top guys don't seem to pay for the academy. So what's your thought on parents that ask you, should my kid travel across the world to go to an academy?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I've worked with a lot of the different academies across the world. And most of the big ones are very good. I mean, they've got great resources. They've got great systems. They provide food and housing and all the different things that an academy does. It's not a predictor of success, though. That's an important factor. It's a great experience. You meet a lot of interesting people. You have an environment that's simple, meaning you wake up, you show up, and everything's taken care of. But if you're trying to be a top player, that decision isn't as important as who's the coach that's going to be working with you, who's the day-to-day person, and who are the people that you're going to be practicing with. They're the two most important factors, not where it's located or who the name on the academy is or anything like that. It's who is going to do that day-to-day work when no one's looking. Those 4 or 5 hours a day of hard work that you do every day for multiple years. That's what's going to determine your success. So, the academy model, there's nothing wrong with it. It's really a good model for many players. There's also many players that succeed really well on, some public court somewhere with an individual coach that just does that hard work every single day. So I can show you examples of both that have been very successful. So I always tell people, make your decisions based on lifestyle, what's most enjoyable for the athlete, and understanding who's going to be the people directing the day-to-day, the advisors, the directors, the coaches, the people that are making the pathway for the player is important, because the best coaches in the world don't make players. They don't screw up players. And that's the biggest factor. You ask any great coach and they'll say, hey, my goal was not to screw this player up. My goal was to not overtrain them sometimes. My goal was to know what tournaments to play and not to play, and just basically let them do their thing, because the best in the world have unique genetics, unique backgrounds. And we have to recognize that at an early age and get out of their way in some respects, while keeping the guardrails on them so they don't get off, and that's the biggest hard part. You see that all too often. These very talented players, they're going down a great path, but then distractions come up. It could be the money, it could be agents, it could be friends that aren't really friends that are pulling them in the wrong directions. It could be coaches that are taking advantage. It even could be family members that they get distracted with what they see as the future. And that's the hardest thing that I deal with. I see these players that have the ability, are doing great, but you also see where the pitfalls are about to be. And then you see when it actually happens, and it's just really sad. And I've seen it for the last 15 years, where these players that should have been perennial top 20, top 30 players that are out of the game now because of bad advice, bad advisors, coaches that didn't necessarily weren't the right fit at that time. Those type of things is where I think the biggest value is of making sure you put yourself around the best people possible.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, we'll jump. Keane's going to ask a few questions that were asked, and fire away, Keane.
All right, thanks, Mark. We've had quite a few solid questions here, so we'll jump into the first one from Jason. He's asking which country's development system is set up to produce the highest number of top 100 players, both on the men's and the women's side in the next few years.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I think it's obvious to see that Italy's probably done the best job in the last 5 years of putting together a system to have a recurring number of players. And it's interesting. There was two things that they did about 7-8 years ago, which is kind of showing itself now. One is they privately invested in coaching education. So they spent quite a bit of resources into improving the quality of the coaching. So that was one. And then the second, which is probably more important, is they very heavily invested in lower level tournaments, futures type level tournaments in the country. So players didn't have to travel as much. There would be a solid amount of competition that was happening on a daily, weekly basis. 15 years ago, when Spain sort of had that huge number of players coming through year after year after year, their biggest reason for that was they had a tournament in Spain, professional event every week of the year, basically. So the players had competition. So, the bigger countries, it's sometimes harder because you have much more people spread out. Like for the US, for example, they have a very good tournament structure, but it is spread out. So it makes it sometimes harder to get all the best players together as consistently as possible. So those are the two biggest things: improve coaching education in the right areas and having very robust and vibrant tournament structure. Because even without coaching, if you just have a lot of good tournaments and you get your better players playing consistently, they're going to succeed. And that's what happened in the 70s and the 60s and the 80s. It wasn't so much about coaching. It was much more about competing and learning. And, if you go back to Nick Bollettieri's early days, and I've asked Nick this question a lot, And he'll say, yeah, it wasn't our coaching. It was we played 3 to 5 sets every day. And these guys would beat each other up every afternoon. They'd do some technical drill work in the morning, and then they'd play 3 to 5 sets every afternoon. And they had a challenge ladder, and the best would succeed. And a lot of players would drop off because they couldn't handle that. They just weren't good enough mentally or physically to live that life and live that schedule. But the ones that were able to make it through, they were the best players in the world. So those are a couple kind of things that I think some places have got away from. And you've got to get back to competing and competition, because that's going to determine who are the ones that are going to make it when it comes down to it.
Awesome. We have a question here from Enrique, and it's about college tennis. Let's take it solely from a tennis perspective, so not a future after tennis, but is college tennis good or bad to prepare for the ATP Tour, solely tennis-wise?
Sure, a great question, and it's something that we've spent a lot of time on. Being based in the US, college tennis is a huge part of the infrastructure here. I mean, the college programs, the facilities are the best in the world, better than any academy. It's easy to say. You've got the best courts. You've got indoor and outdoor in most places. Strength and conditioning, physical training. You've got the best facilities, unbelievable food, great housing. Travel to events and all that. So you've got these resources that are provided free of charge, and you get the education side. So as a option, it's one of the best options for most players because of all those factors. How does it predict future success? Well, on the ATP Tour, you get 4 to 6% of all top 100 players ever went to college, and more than half of those are US players. So it's not a big predictor of success on the ATP Tour. So just looking at it objectively, you'll always hear every year about that one person that has a good result. John Isner is a great example, Kevin Anderson, that have had long careers after going to college. So there's definitely a path there, but it's not the major pathway. So it's important to understand that you're going to know at 18, at 17, where your level's at. And if your level's not at a direct entry to the top 100, the lifestyle and the ability to, use resources and save money, college tennis is a great option because you can develop your skills, you can get high level, and we've looked at if you're playing 1 or 2, sometimes even 3 at a top 50 program in the US in college, that's equivalent to playing, making the semis or final of futures, or even making the quarters of many lower level challenges. So you're playing at a high level every day. If you're number 1 in your team and you're in the top 50 program, every match you play is a challenger level tournament. So you're getting that constant competition. So it just comes down to, is it a good predictor of pro success? No, it's definitely not a good predictor, but there are players every year. Normally it averages out at 1, sometimes 2 players per every class. So every year comes out of college and has a top 100 career. And on the women's side, it's even less.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic answer. Talking about the mentality of breaking into the top 100, say a player breaks in quite early, do you think that's an advantage or a disadvantage because there may be increased pressure and expectation?
Yeah, and it's normally if they break in early, they're a really good tennis player. So I don't think it's a disadvantage. The challenge is, are they prepared for it emotionally more than anything? Physically, they've shown that they can get there. The challenge is, physically, they may have got there because of youth and ability, but their body is about to break down, meaning that they haven't done their injury prevention work, they haven't taken care of their body, they're not professional about their recovery, their nutrition, all these other factors that will catch up with them very quickly. So when you break in early, a lot of the time the players think it's, okay, this is just what's meant to happen and I can continue doing what I'm doing. And unfortunately, that changes very quickly. First major injury, the lifestyle of traveling after a year or 2 for some players becomes challenging because they get all these distractions in different cities. So I don't think it's a negative breaking in early. It's actually a positive and means that the players at a really high level, but they have to have better advisors, because most of the time the player themselves hasn't had the experience, and they need a coach, they need an agent, they need an advisor, a team around them to help them navigate the challenges. And the best agents are the ones that understand that and put certain guardrails around those young players, how they deal with the media, when they deal with the media, how many sponsor events they do, how they interact with the fans, because that's a huge part of the sport. And you have to train a young athlete to deal with the fans the right way, because you want to feed off their energy. You don't want to see them as a distraction. And it's really important to teach that at a young age.
We have a really interesting one here from Ryan, and Ryan's talking about, he's wondering if you have any data on players that stay predominantly with one coach their whole career, or players that actually switch coaches. How does that work out?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and something we have looked at a lot. And in general, the player is the determining factor, not the coach in their pathway. That's why you see some of these players that will go through 5, 6, 7 coaches in a career and pretty much stay around the same ranking, give or take, 20, 30 spots. So that would suggest that the coach hasn't had a huge influence. But then you have had these coaches that have just clicked with a certain player, and it was what the player needed at that time. And it took a player from, say, 100 in the world to 40 in the world. And it's hard to disprove that was the coach's doing, but it could have just happened because the player was open to buying into those changes. And it wasn't necessarily the coach that was the unique factor. It was just the player was ready. So it's a really hard question to answer but a quality coach is more than X's and O's. A quality coach for a professional tennis player is a lifestyle coach. It's a travel partner, someone that they're on the road with 30 plus weeks of the year. They know when and how to negotiate with the player, when to practice some days, when to rest, when to, not go out and get distracted, when to get distracted, when they need a few days to blow off steam and get out of there, and when to schedule that. That's the big difference between a junior development coach, who's much more about strategy, technique, match play, all that. A pro coach still has to do some of that, but about 80% of their job is all the other stuff. That's why you see some of these top 10 coaches that are working with top 10 players sort of usually, are looked at differently from some of those high level players, because they understand that the majority of what they do isn't X's and O's. I mean, there's a little bit to it. It's more managing the distractions and managing the lifestyle, which is the hardest part once you get higher up in the rankings.
We'll do last 2 questions, Mark, because we tried to keep them to an hour and we have so many questions, we just won't get to them all. But we have one here. Out of the qualities which determine whether someone has potential, which one would you say is the most vital?
It's a tough one. I'll say what you won't make it if you don't have certain things. One is physical. You have to be able to play a full schedule or close to a full schedule. It's really tough to be a professional tennis player if your body's always break down. So availability and being able to compete on a regular basis is goal number one. Yet you really have to be able to do that to have a sustained career. So that's priority above and beyond everything else, because there's plenty of players that have ability but break down and they never get going. So that's really, really important at the base level. 2 is you have to have weapons now. And weapons aren't just forehands and backhands. It could be speed, it could be endurance, it could be a mindset. But you have to have multiple weapons, meaning usually a minimum of 3. So it could be a serve, a forehand, and speed. It could be a serve and forehand and a mindset. It could be endurance and backhand and return a serve. So you got to have at least 3 weapons that can allow you to win matches. Because at the highest levels, the pace of the game is different, the margin for error is different, and you have to be able to find ways that you can on a consistent basis. So those are the 2 biggest. And then the for most players, not every single one of them, because you can have such genetic talent and ability that you can overcome this, but it's this professionalism and work ethic that a lot of these players use to get them inside the top 100 that may not have the physical gifts or the tennis gifts that some of these other players have, but they work every single day and they slowly, improve in areas they evaluate and know they need to work on. So those would be the three areas that if you have to have the physical capabilities to last and play a full schedule. You have to have the weapons to play at the highest level, which is where a lot of players they just don't have the weapons. They work hard, they play the right way, they do a lot of things right. They get their game tapped out at 150, 200, 250 in the world. And you see that every single day, that it's just, they just don't have that next level game to compete with the best in the world.
That's perfect. I think we'll leave it at that, Mark. That's all the questions pretty much that we'll do today, but thanks a lot for answering them, and I'll pass you back to Fabio.
Okay, guys, Mark, that was great. Some great questions there. Some of the best that we've had over the past 7 webinars. And so thank you very much for your time. For those that want to know more about Mark, you can check out the kovacsinstitute.com. I think it is, Mark, is it? The Instagram account. There's loads of information. Something we didn't talk about today was this whole benchmarking. I know he has a product based on benchmarking for juniors to see where your level is. Check that out. It's really good. He talked about in our podcast episode. We'll include a link to it when we send out a replay of this over the next few days. And really exciting, Mark. I'm not sure if you have anything else to add before we cut off, but we'll give Mark the last word of the day.
No, this is a really important topic. Just realize that hard work takes you a long way, but you have to have the ability as well. And it's this combination of ability and hard work which will get players to the top of the game. So it's definitely of interest, and I appreciate everything you're doing from helping to spread the word about the realities of what's happening out there.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And last thing, surround yourself with a good team. That's really important, the right people. So thanks a lot, everybody, for listening. Any questions, shoot me a message, and replay will be available in a few days and emailed out to you. And anything else, Mark has his inbox open, so you can find him easily online. We're all tech savvy here. Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks, everybody. Cian, thanks. And we'll be back after Christmas with more webinars. Not sure exactly what yet, but we'll be back. Thank you very much. Bye.